The gallery at Halcroft House ran the length of the east wing, and in November, the light through its tall windows was the color of old bone. Constance Merritt stood on the third rung of the library steps with her lens glass pressed to the upper field of the embroidered crest, the silk thread so fine and so old that the lamplight could not always distinguish one color from its neighbor. She was not supposed to be here at this hour. The housekeeper had told her the family rooms were closed in the morning. She had come anyway, because the falsehood was here, threaded into the azure ground of the Halcroft escutcheon, woven in with such careful skill that only someone who spent her days watching how thread behaved under honest hands would know it for what it was. She heard the door before she heard the step, a single measured footfall. She did not move the lens glass. "The commission," said a voice from below her, "was for the south drawing-room hangings, not this." She looked down. The Earl of Braemore was standing at the foot of the steps with his hands behind his back, and an expression that was not quite irritation, because the irritation had passed too quickly into something else. He was watching her with a stillness that she did not know what to make of. Most men looked at a woman on a library ladder and waited for her to come down. He was looking at the glass in her hand. "My lord." She descended 2 rungs, which still left her above his eye-line. "I will return to the drawing-room hangings when I have satisfied myself on a question." "What question?" She turned the lens glass in her fingers. The needle case was in her apron pocket, and her father's handwriting was inside it, and she had carried both since the morning she had found him at his work table with his lamp burned out and his notation unfinished. She had carried both for 7 months. "A matter of the azure dye," she said. "It can wait, if you prefer." He did not say it could wait. He looked at the crest above her, and then at her hands. And then he said, in a voice that asked nothing, it did not need to know, "How long have you been up there?" "Since 6:30, my lord." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his jaw. He stepped back and gestured toward the floor, not impatiently, and she came down and straightened her apron and waited. "Come back at noon," he said. "The light is better." He left without explaining what he meant. She was not entirely sure she had been ordered away, or given something else entirely. She had arrived at Halcroft House in the 3rd week of October, summoned by the house steward on behalf of Lady Dorothea Halcroft, Dowager Countess of Braemore, who wished the season's damaged embroideries assessed and repaired before the family opened the house for winter. It was regular work for an embroiderer of modest reputation, and Constance had modest reputation and pressing need, and so she had come with her case and her scissors and her inheritance of 640, her father's precise written notes, packed in a small cartouche needle case of plain walnut that his hands had worn smooth at the hinges. Thomas Merritt had been a craftsman of the old school, the kind who could read a thread's origin from its twist and a dye's age from its fade, and who had kept notebooks as other men kept ledgers. He had died in March, before he could give his final notebook to anyone who would act upon it, and the world had decided in the months that followed that he had gone a little strange in his last year, a grieving widower who saw patterns where there were none. The vicar had said something gentle and insufficient at the graveside. The guild had sent a letter of condolence written in the hand of a secretary. Constance had folded both letters and placed them in the drawer where her father kept the documents that deserved to be kept, and had not wept until she was alone in his workroom, with the lamp burning low and the needle case in her hands, reading for the first time what he had written in the last 6 months of his life with the patient. Careful attention of a man who knew he might not be believed. Constance knew what he had seen. She had seen it herself in the Halcroft Commission papers when they arrived, when she had unrolled the detail drawings of the gallery crest and found the seam in the heraldry that should not have been there. The crest of the Earls of Braemore showed a field azure, charged with a silver falcon above a chevron, or, granted by letters patent in the reign of George II, and confirmed twice since. Constance knew grants. She had grown up reading them across her father's work table. The upper field of the Halcroft crest was wrong, not in its form, which was perfect, but in the twist of its silk, which was continental and machine-assisted in a way that put its manufacture no earlier than 1780, 30 years after the original grant, and she had known since the second morning of her commission that someone had replaced the authentic upper field with a reproduction, and she had not yet decided what to do with the knowledge. What she had decided was that she would look until she was certain before she said anything at all. Lady Dorothea had received her on the first day with the particular species of courtesy that functions as a measurement. Constance had stood in the morning room while the dowager looked at her from a chair by the window, fan in her lap, silver worked at the hem of her gown, and had felt herself being categorized in the way that women who had never needed to work understood other women who always had. Lady Dorothea was not unkind in the way that cruel people are unkind. She was kind in the way that people of great station are kind when they are confident no correction is coming. Sir Aldous tells me your father did some work for this house 20 years ago, the dowager said, her voice carrying the specific warmth of a closing door. He did, my lady. The heraldic panels in the library annex. Yes. A pause in which the fan moved once. A capable man, by all accounts, though I understand his last years were somewhat. She let it sit unfinished. Constance had heard the sentence completed in other mouths and did not need it here. The dowager called her, in the aside she made to Sir Aldous in the passage just outside, where the door was not quite closed. The seamstress and her fancies. Sir Aldous was a tall man with a solicitor's careful face and hands that she noticed pressed flat to his thighs when he listened. He had said nothing in response to the dowager's remark that Constance could hear, but she had heard his silence, and it had the shape of agreement. She spent 3 weeks on the south drawing-room hangings, and did the work as well as it had ever been done, because the work was her argument, and had always been her argument. And she was not in the habit of making weak ones. The other embroiderers in the household noticed. The upper housemaids noticed. One of the footmen, a young man named Coates, who had the habit of pausing in doorways as though the rooms beyond them required assessment, had watched her work for nearly 20 minutes one afternoon before clearing his throat and asking whether the crimson in the central panel might be brightened, and had listened with serious attention when she explained at length why it should not be. The dowager did not notice. The Earl she saw rarely. He was a man of deliberate and infrequent motion, which meant that when he moved through a room, he occupied more of it than his physical dimensions suggested. He was in his middle 30s, broad through the shoulder, with dark hair going very slightly to silver at the left temple, and a face whose default expression was a kind of watchful absence, as though he had trained himself not to perform attentiveness, but only to exercise it. She observed that he asked fewer questions than most men of his station, and that the questions he asked were specific. She observed that he read his correspondence standing up, which was unusual. She observed, in the second week, that he had stopped outside the door of the south drawing-room 3 times without entering, and that on each occasion he had proceeded down the corridor and said nothing. She did not tell herself that these observations signified anything. They were simply observations, the kind her hands made automatically, the cataloging instinct of a woman who spent her days attending to things smaller than other people thought worth noticing. She was not without intelligence on the subject of men who stopped in doorways. She was simply careful, in the way that people with no margin for error learn to be careful about what she permitted herself to conclude. If you have ever sat with a piece of work and felt the pull of something wrong before your eyes could name it, you will understand something of what those weeks were like. Stay close, because what her hands found would change more than she knew. It was on a Tuesday evening in early November, the drawing room hangings complete, and the smaller commission for the library chairs barely begun, that she found him outside the laundry passage. She had not found him exactly. She had heard his voice and stopped, because the voice was not directed at her. He was speaking to a child. The child was 5 years old at most, one of the children of the undergardener, who had brought the child to the house in a christening gown so badly damaged at the hem that the lace had separated entirely from the ground fabric. Constance had taken the gown in 3 days earlier, without being asked and without charge, because the lace was 16th century Flemish and deserved better than a burial. She had stayed past dark on 2 evenings to restore it. Edmund was crouched to the child's level in the passage, holding the returned gown, listening with full attention, while the child explained in some detail how he had torn it himself at Christmas. The explanation was elaborate and somewhat implausible, involving a dog, a toppled garden urn, and a sequence of events that shifted slightly in its particulars with each retelling. Edmund received it with the gravity it deserved and asked 2 questions about the dog that had allegedly been involved. The child answered, "I'ld." Edmund stood and put the gown carefully over his arm and said, in the voice he used when he was not making an argument, but simply stating what was true, "These things can be mended." He then stood looking at the gown for a moment with his head slightly lowered. Not at the child, who had gone quiet in the way that children go quiet when an adult's attention turns inward. At the hem, where the Flemish lace had been restored. He could not have known what he was looking at. He was not an embroiderer, and the restoration was, by design, invisible. What he saw was only what was there. What he was doing, she thought, was the same thing she did when she examined a piece of work whose maker had not been paid attention to. He was paying attention. The child said something about supper and went away down the passage. Edmund stood a moment longer in the empty passage. Then he walked in the opposite direction, and she heard his step diminish toward the east wing, measured and even, as it always was. She had not known she was there. She had taken 1 step back into the shadow of the linen press before he turned, and by the time he was in the corridor, she was at the other end of it, going the wrong direction, hearing her own pulse in her throat. He was not cold, exactly. He had trained himself to be contained, which was a different thing. She understood the difference in her bones before she could have said why. She had met cold men. They moved through rooms with the assurance of people who did not require those rooms to contain anything worth noticing. He moved through rooms as though he was looking for something. She did not permit herself to speculate what. She had taken her father's needle case to Agnes Reeve on a Wednesday afternoon, riding the 2 miles to the town in a borrowed cart with the case in her lap and a fragment of the Crest's upper field thread wrapped in paper in her pocket. Agnes Reeve was 63 years old and had been a master embroiderer for the Royal School for 4 decades and knew more about silk thread and its origins than anyone in the county. She received Constance at her work table and took the needle case and read Thomas Merritt's notes in silence. The reading took 12 minutes. Agnes asked to see the thread. She held it under her own glass for a long time. "Your father was correct," Agnes said without preamble. "The twist is continental. The dye is synthetic in a way that was not available in this country before 1790 at the earliest. Whoever stitched this upper field was working from an authentic original, copying it with considerable skill, but they were not working with the original materials, and they were not working in the year of the original grant." Constance had known this. Knowing it from Agnes's mouth was different from knowing it from her own hands. "Who commissioned the replacement?" Agnes asked. "I do not know who gave the order. I know who had the authority and the access." She folded the thread back into its paper. The question is what it conceals. What it concealed, as Thomas Merritt's notes made plain across 4 pages in his close and careful hand, was a second marriage. The 6th Earl of Braymore had married twice, once, in the public record, to the woman who had produced Edmund's father, and once before that, secretly and to a woman of rank insufficient for the public declaration, in a ceremony whose record the needle case contained a reference to, buried in a footnote of a guild account from the decade in question. If the first marriage was legitimate, the second produced the legal heir. If it was not, then Edmund's grandfather had no true claim, and the Halcroft earldom rested on a grant that followed from a man who was already, in law and in the sight of the church, a husband. The forgery did not create the claim. It concealed the question. And a question of that magnitude, answered in one direction, meant that the current earl held his title and his house by a thread no thicker than a strand of copied silk. Agnes set down the needle case and said, in the careful voice of a woman who had examined evidence for a long time and understood that evidence had consequences, "Your father wrote that he believed the replacement was made in the decade of 1780 to 1790. The 6th Earl died in 1783. Someone commissioned this replacement during the years his successor was securing the title." She folded her hands. That would have required a person with access to the Crest, knowledge of its irregularity, and a great deal to lose if the irregularity were recognized. "Yes," Constance said. "And a great deal to gain," Agnes said, "if it were not." There was a question she had not yet asked herself, because she had been attending to what was in the thread and what was in the notes, and had not yet allowed herself to think about the man in the house whose title rested on all of it. Edmund's elder brother had died 18 months ago. A fall from a horse on familiar ground at dawn. No witness. The horse found grazing at the paddock fence 3 hours later, with its tack still on. Edmund had inherited a house and an earldom, and, she now understood, a forgery that someone had gone to considerable trouble to make permanent. She wondered if he had ever looked at the crest. She wondered if he had ever looked at it the way she had. She had still been sitting with Agnes when the note came from Halcroft House in Sir Aldous' hand, requesting that she return at her earliest convenience to attend to a matter regarding the commission. She went. She should perhaps not have gone alone. The great hall was not empty. Sir Aldous had timed the summons well. There were guests in the house for the week, a party of 4 families invited by Lady Dorothea for the shooting. And they were assembled at the periphery of the hall in the particular arrangement of people who have been told something interesting is about to happen and have positioned themselves accordingly. The dowager was seated near the fireplace. Edmund was not present. Sir Aldous stood with his hands behind his back and said in a carrying voice that he had been made aware of certain impertinent claims regarding the provenance of the family's heraldic commission, claims which originated with a tradesperson whose late father had been known in his last months to make similar impertinent observations, and that the family wished it understood that such claims were without foundation, and, in Sir Aldous' professional opinion, slanderous. He did not shout. He did not need to. The room was very quiet. "The seamstress and her fancies," Lady Dorothea said from her chair, in a voice that was not loud either, and the room heard it, and several people moved almost imperceptibly away from where Constance was standing. She stood very still. The needle case was in her apron pocket. Her hands, which were at her sides, did not move. She said, "I have submitted my father's notes and a thread sample to Agnes Reeve for professional assessment. Mrs. Reeve is a master embroiderer of the Royal School with 40 years' experience. Her opinion is available in writing." Sir Aldous said that the family was not in the business of entertaining guild opinions procured by employees with personal grievances. She said nothing further. There was nothing further to say in this room. The dismissal came the following morning, carried by the housekeeper, Mrs. Peel, who delivered it with genuine regret and the distinct discomfort of someone who had been asked to repeat language that troubled her. The dowager had said, Mrs. Peel told her quietly, that the seamstress and her fancies were no longer required at Halcroft House. Mrs. Peel had been asked to ensure she left by noon. Constance packed her case. She was methodical about it, because method was what she had when everything else was unavailable, and she had learned from her father that careful attention to the work at hand was the only dignity a person could guarantee for themselves in adverse circumstances. She folded the spare apron first, then the smaller scissors in their cloth, then the linen samples, each in its paper sleeve. She wrapped the needle case in a length of plain linen and set it at the top of her bag, and placed her hands flat on the lid for a moment before she closed it. She did not cry, because crying was for private rooms, and this room had not been hers. The house was quiet around her in the way that houses go quiet when something has been decided and the sound of the decision has finished reverberating off the walls. A footman passed the door and did not look in. One of the upper housemaids came to the top of the servants' stair and saw her and went back down without speaking. In the distance, from the direction of the great hall, she could hear Lady Dorothea speaking to someone at a normal conversational volume, the voice carrying its usual note of polished assurance, the assurance of a person who had managed this kind of morning before and expected the morning to resolve without incident, as such mornings generally did. She walked down the east corridor toward the entrance hall and past the gallery and did not stop. She did not look at the crest above the hearth. She had already looked at it as long as she needed to. The truth was in the thread, and in the needle case, and in 2 of her father's notebooks. And none of those things were hanging on the gallery wall of Halcroft House. They were coming with her. Edmund was not in the entrance hall. She had not expected him to be. He had heard nothing directly, as far as she knew, and the order of the house had moved without him. That was what such orders relied upon. The machinery that crushed rarely needed its lord to be present. It moved on its own, and the lord was simply there afterwards, inhabiting the space the machinery had cleared. She did not hold this against him. She did not have the luxury of holding things against people who had not yet had the information she had. What she held against people was what they did, after they knew. She walked out into the November morning and did not look back at the house. She went to London. Agnes Reeve had given her one name: Mr. Clarence Weston was second herald at the College of Arms, who had on 2 previous occasions in his career examined questions of heraldic forgery for the court, and whose reputation for methodical exactness was, Agnes said, without parallel in the city. Constance wrote to him before she left, and received his reply at her cousin's house in Marylebone 2 days after her arrival. He would see her on Thursday. He would need the notes, the thread, and a written statement of her professional credentials. She spent 2 evenings writing the statement. She wrote it as her father would have written it, without sentiment, without excess, with only what could be verified. She listed her training, her commissions, the houses in which she had worked, and the specific nature of the work. She listed her father's credentials and his years of practice, and the specific notation he had made in the needle case, cross-referencing the guild account he had found in a county archive 6 months before his death. Mr. Weston received her at the college on Thursday morning and read everything she had brought him twice. He took the thread to his laboratory and was gone for 40 minutes. When he returned, he sat down and placed his hands flat on the table and said, without preamble, "Your father's analysis is correct in every particular. The upper field of the Halcroft crest has been replaced at some point between 1780 and 1795. I can date the silk within that range because the manufacturing process for this grade of twist was not adopted commercially before that decade. Whoever commissioned the replacement was meticulous, but not an expert, and they could not have known that the dye lot they used would be identifiable in this way to someone who knew to look. He said he would draft a formal report to the college. He said the matter would need to be referred to the relevant authorities. He asked whether the Earl of Braymore was aware of her findings. She said he was not. The formal report arrived at Halcroft House 9 days later. She knew this because Edmund came himself to Marylebone. She was at the table in her cousin's sitting room with a pair of small scissors and a length of linen that wanted straightening when her cousin appeared in the doorway with an expression Constance had never seen on her face before. Behind her cousin, in the narrow hall of a house that did not often receive callers of any quality, stood the Earl of Braymore in a coat that was darkened at the shoulder from rain, without hat, without cards, without the procedural machinery of a formal call. He looked as though he had not stopped to observe any of it. Constance set down the scissors. He said, without sitting down, because she had not yet invited him to sit, and he was, she noted, observing the form even now. The college's letter arrived this morning. I have read it. He paused. I have also read the account my steward prepared for me of the morning in the great hall. Your steward was not present that morning, she said. He has ears, Edmund said, and he was present in the afternoon, when Sir Aldous came to him to request that certain documentation be removed from the house records. The steward declined and came to me. The room was small and had the particular quality of rooms in which people live carefully within constrained means. The furniture serviceable and well kept, the curtains a faded blue that had once been brighter. She watched him observe the room without comment, and understood from the quality of his observation that he was seeing it the way she saw things, with attention rather than assessment, and that he had registered the economy of the space, and was making no conclusion about it except that she lived in it, and it was where she had chosen to receive him. There was something she had not permitted herself to think, in the 10 days since she had left Halcroft House, about what it had cost him to come here without ceremony, without his household's procedural armor, with rain on his coat and no cards, and an expression that she read, for the first time without difficulty, as something that was not authority, but its opposite. She permitted herself to think it now. You suspected something was wrong, she said. Before the college's letter. Before I came. He looked at her for a moment. My brother rode that ground in all weathers for 12 years, he said. He knew every stone of it. He did not say anything more than that. He did not need to. He asked her, formally, if she would return to Halcroft House. He asked her if she would bring the needle case. He said it in the voice he used when something mattered, and he was not going to say it twice. She brought the needle case. The gallery was full when they arrived. Edmund had not assembled the household in the way that dramatic summons are arranged. He had simply sent word that the matter of the commission would be resolved that afternoon, and the word had spread in the way that significant words do in closed houses. And by 2 o'clock, there were 14 people standing in the gallery with varying degrees of composure. Mrs. Peel, the housekeeper, stood near the door with her hands clasped, and her face the face of a woman who had repeated an order she was not comfortable with, and had been waiting ever since to learn whether it had been the right thing to do. The footman Coates stood behind her. The 2 visiting house guests who remained in residence stood together near the hearth, having come, Constance suspected, out of the same impulse that brings people to the edge of something significant when they sense it approaching. Lady Dorothea sat beneath the crest in the chair that was, by position and habit, her chair. Sir Aldous stood near the window with his hands very still, and his face the color of February. Edmund placed the college's letter on the table. He did not read from it. He said, "Mrs. Reeves' assessment and the college's report are in agreement on every material point. The upper field of the crest above this hearth is not original. It was replaced within the decade before my grandfather assumed the earldom." He looked at Sir Aldous. "The question of who commissioned the replacement and what it was designed to conceal is a matter for the college and, in due course, for the courts. That is not the matter I am addressing today." Sir Aldous said, in the voice of a man exercising his last remaining professional reflex, that the letter was from a minor collegiate official who had examined a single thread sample of contested provenance, and that the family had every right to contest the methodology and the finding through the appropriate channels before drawing any conclusions, and that he strongly advised the Earl to permit him to correspond with the college before any further statements were made. Edmund looked at him for a moment without expression. He said, "You were asked to remove documentation from the house records. You asked my steward to assist you." Sir Aldous said nothing. "Thank you," Edmund said, which was not gratitude, and everyone present understood it as such. Lady Dorothea said something then, low and precise, in the register she used when she was still certain of the ground beneath her. She said that the matter had been raised by a tradesperson with a personal interest in disrupting the family's standing, and that the opinion of a hired needlewoman ought not to be placed above the considered judgment of a family's professional advisers of 30 years. Her voice was steady. Her hands were steady. She had managed this kind of mourning before. She had managed it, in fact, for nearly 40 years. The room was very quiet. Edmund turned and looked at Constance where she stood at the edge of the assembled company, and then he walked across the gallery to stand beside her. Not in front of her. Beside her. Beside. The 14 people in the room watched this crossing in silence. It was not a long walk. It took perhaps 7 seconds. She felt each of those seconds the way she felt the tension in a thread being drawn through cloth, the particular quality of attention that precedes something being made permanent. He said, "Her father was right. The crest is forged. She stays." 12 words. He did not raise his voice. The sentence did not require volume. Lady Dorothea's fan opened and then did not move. Sir Aldous' hands, which had been pressed flat to his thighs, went very still. Mrs. Peel unclasped her hands and then clasped them again, which was not distress, but its opposite. Several people in the room found it necessary to look at the floor or at the middle distance, and one of the visiting house guests near the hearth made a small involuntary sound that she covered with her hand, and Constance saw the woman look at her with an expression that was not pity, but recognition. The expression of a person who had once or twice in their life watched someone receive what they deserved. The room had decided, and then the room had been corrected, and now it was deciding again in the space of a few held seconds, the way rooms do when someone of sufficient authority says the thing that cannot be unsaid. She did not know what her face was doing. She was aware, in the specific way that one becomes aware of one's own body in moments of great stillness, that she was standing very straight, and that her hands were at her sides, and that the needle case was in her coat pocket, and that her breathing was slower than it had been a minute ago. She was aware that Edmund was standing beside her, with his shoulder a few inches from her own, and that he had not moved away. The gathering began to disperse in the deliberate, quiet manner of people who have witnessed something and need some time alone to determine what they think about it. Lady Dorothea rose from her chair and left the room without speaking, which was its own kind of statement. The statement of a person who has recognized a loss and chosen not to make it more public than it already is. Sir Aldous followed her. The guests moved toward the door. Mrs. Peel lingered a moment at the threshold, looked at Constance, and gave a single small nod before she went. Edmund said quietly, when the room was nearly empty, "Your hands are cold." She looked down. They were. She had not noticed. He reached for the right one and enclosed it briefly in both of his, not looking at her while he did it, looking instead at the crest above the hearth, as though this were a casual thing, a practical correction. The warmth went through her fingers and up her arm and into the middle of her chest where she had been holding. For 7 months. The particular cold of a person who has been carrying something alone and has not permitted themselves to notice the weight of it. She said nothing. He released her hand. What followed was procedural and not without pain. Sir Aldous resigned his position before the week was out, under circumstances that were not described publicly, but that left him without recourse in the matter of his professional reputation. The College of Arms conducted its examination over the following 2 months and produced a report that confirmed the forgery and named, in the dry and careful language of heraldic inquiry, the circumstances that the forgery had been designed to conceal. The question of the earldom itself was more complex and took longer, and involved several men in wigs in several rooms that Constance never entered. But the outcome, as Edmund's solicitor explained it to her in the spring, was that the line of succession was validated on grounds of long-standing public recognition, the irregular first marriage having been conducted without legal ceremony by a man not authorized to perform one. And so, the Halcroft title stood, somewhat chastened, on firmer ground than it had occupied before. Lady Dorothea went to her daughter in Bath, and was not, as far as Constance ever knew, cruel to anyone in particular about what had happened. She was simply no longer there. The absence was, in its way, a correction. Agnes Reeve received a formal commendation from the college, which she framed and hung above her work table, and which pleased her less than the needle case full of Thomas Merritt's notes, which she asked to borrow for an article she was writing for the Guild's annual proceedings, and which she returned in March with a short letter that said, among other things, that she had told the college's chief herald that Thomas Merritt had been 30 years ahead of his time, and that the college should have listened to craftspeople before they were dead. The gallery was given back its morning light in February. Edmund had the window at the east end unboarded, and the room was brighter than it had apparently been for a generation. The crest above the hearth was taken down in the 3rd week of that month, removed for the college's further examination, and then returned, having been untouched in the sense that the college's examiners had documented rather than disturbed, but changed entirely in the sense that everyone who looked at it now looked at it differently. It was a cold afternoon in February when Constance climbed the library steps again, not because the crest needed anything from her, but because she had learned, in the months since November, that some questions required completion, even after their answers were confirmed. She pressed the lens glass to the upper field one final time. The foreign silk looked exactly as it had always looked. It was the knowing that was different. Edmund came into the gallery the same way he had come in November, without announcement, without the preparatory sound of a man who wished to be heard arriving. He had learned that she was not startled by silence, and she had learned that he understood the difference between a person who was working and a person who had finished. She came down from the steps. The needle case was on the mantelpiece, where she had set it that morning, because this was, increasingly, the room where she kept the things that mattered. The walnut had been repolished by someone, she had not asked who, and it caught the February light in the way that well-tended things catch light. He stood at the other end of the mantel and looked at it for a moment without speaking. She had grown to understand that his silences were not absences, but the opposite. And she stood in this one with him, in the way she had learned to stand in rooms where important work was being done. "Your father's name," he said, "will be in the college's published proceedings, in full, and with the finding attributed to him." She had not known this was coming. The heat in her face was sudden and entirely without warning, and she turned slightly so that the window was on her other side, though this was a reflex rather than a concealment, and they both knew it. "He would not have wanted acknowledgement," she said, when she could trust her voice. "I know." He looked at her. "I want him to have it anyway." The cartouche needle case sat on the mantelpiece between the February light and the warmth of the room. Outside the tall window, the estate grounds were silver gray with frost, and a single rook moved in a slow circle above the field beyond the kitchen garden, and the morning was very still. She said his name. Not his title, which was the form she had observed until recently, but his name, which she had used for the first time 6 days ago in a different room with a fire behind her and his hands around her own, and which he had received with the expression of a man who had waited to hear something he was not certain was coming. He crossed the room. She stayed where she was, because she did not need to move toward him, because he was already there. His hand came to her face in the careful way of a person who has thought about this gesture for longer than the moment suggests, and she felt in that careful deliberateness the same quality she had felt in his question about the child and the christening gown, the thing beneath the containment that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with what a person chooses to see. The needle case caught the light on the mantelpiece. Her father's notes were inside it, and the thread sample was inside it, and what had been recorded in patient and careful hands before anyone was ready to listen was inside it too, and it sat in this room as though it had always belonged here, which perhaps it had. The frost held through the afternoon. The rook settled somewhere beyond the window. The fire had been laid but not yet lit, and the room had the quality of late winter mornings that are about to become something else, the particular light of a day that is not finished arriving. Thank you for staying until the end. If Constance's patient work moved you, leave a word in the comments for the craftspeople whose evidence outlives their doubt. The needle case sat on the mantelpiece of Halcroft House for many years after, and Thomas Merritt's name was in the published proceedings, and the light in the gallery was very good.